Conversations surrounding Souls-likes typically focus on their combat or their bosses. I want to zero in on level design in this video, so I'm going to talk about Dark Souls 1 and 2, as well as the newer Souls-like, Lies of P. While this video should be quite short, I want to make a longer video in the future talking about level design in regards to the other mechanics of these games. But for now though, I'm going to start with holistic large-scale level design, and then I want to focus in on the more nitty-gritty sections of these games, the specific levels. Let's start by talking about level design on a larger scale, which to me means progression through the game. Both Dark Souls 1 and 2 have quite varied progression through their games, and this in my opinion is due to the hub world that both of these games have, as well as some shortcuts that have been dotted around the map. Both Firelink Shrine and Majula have paths that go in several different directions from the start of the game, but some of them are blocked or otherwise inaccessible, so it's up to you as the player to figure out where you want to go and how to get there. Dark Souls has several areas accessible right from Firelink Shrine, the central hub area found after following the tutorial. Undeadburg, New Londo Ruins and the Catacombs can all be found immediately, and players with the Master Key can enter the Valley of the Drakes and Blighttown from the New Londo shortcut. This being said, the enemies in most of these areas are quite miserable to face off against at the start of the game, encouraging the player to come back later without forcing them to. The game also rewards this curiosity even without having defeated any enemies, by placing consumable souls and some great weapons like the Estoc and the Zweihander in your path. There are 2 bells which must be rung in order to progress the game, and the player is told upon reaching Firelink Shrine that they are in Undead Parish and Blighttown. As most players will end up gravitating towards Undeadburg, as all other options will likely be too difficult, they will soon be led to the parish. The parish opens up further pathways that link back and overlap, resulting in 2 main entryways into Blighttown. This means that players have several choices in how they approach these areas, and thus which areas they end up visiting before Anor Londo. The game stiffens up in terms of these kinds of choices following Anor Londo, but the bosses that must be defeated to complete the game can be done in any order. The game becomes more linear, yet still has player-driven exploration that makes finding and completing these areas far more engaging. This design philosophy naturally has its caveats, as the optional nature of its earlier areas can trivialise them upon returning, or make a newer player struggle through an area intended for later. These experiences, while not perfectly balanced, can be rewarding for their own reasons. Fighting familiar enemies after becoming tangibly stronger, as well as more skilled, is very satisfying for someone who typically struggles with these games. On the flip side, being stuck in the Tomb of the Giants before I'd unlocked Sen's Fortress was very memorable, and I felt really accomplished upon fighting my way back to Firelink Shrine. The catacombs and the tomb below it are a trap in every way. They're a path that doesn't really lead anywhere, it's dark, it's full of monsters and these awful skeletons, yet it's always available, right from the start. It's also beatable. You can make it to the bottom, and Pinwheel, the boss of the area, drops great loot and is pretty much a cakewalk compared to the rest of the catacombs. These moments of finding areas that aren't immediately relevant to your main quest form a distinct feeling of existing in a wider world, one unconcerned with your well-being, rather than simply giving you a suspiciously proportional challenge at each step of your journey. Zooming in to specific level design, Dark Souls constantly rewards curious and observant players with loot, challenging them with outnumbered fights or confusing architecture. Typically capping off each level is a boss fight, often without a bonfire directly preceding it. This adds a layer of difficulty, as the player must also learn the best way to reach the boss, saving their precious Estus flasks to have sufficient healing for the boss. This being said, The difficulty of a runback is more static than that of a boss fight, and running a solved route over and over on a particularly tricky boss can be tedious, which is why it's so important that Dark Souls has these rewards for exploration. Take the Bell Gargoyles runback for example. It's a short distance, but the narrow corridor is challenging for any weapon without an easy overhead or lunging attack, and the swarm of enemies alongside the mage makes for a risky sprint over to the boss room. Thankfully, Undead Parish has a fair few secrets in itself, and links back to Firelink Shrine, so you can go explore some of the areas that were previously too difficult, or head over to the blacksmith to upgrade your weapon, or go to Darkroot or Lower Undeadburg, both of which are accessible by this point. Sen's Fortress is a similar situation with its runback, being a gauntlet of traps and enemies, yet it has plenty of loot and side paths within it that connect back to the main path, and a hidden bonfire to make the runback easier. Additionally, the boss is much less difficult than Quelaag or the Bell Gargoyles, so the runback is made less punishing as a result. Let's do a quick recap of Dark Souls in regards to progression and level design using this map here that I've illustrated. Starting from Firelink Shrine, which is represented by the bonfire here, the player is given several different options in terms of where to go, but is funneled towards one using difficulty. This main path then connects to several other areas, be they side areas or shortcuts back to areas like Blighttown or Firelink Shrine itself. Inquisitive players are constantly rewarded with new locations and loot as long as they are up to the challenge of actually fighting through those areas. And the game as a whole gains a level of immersiveness as a result of all these places interconnecting in ways that sort of make sense. In the second half of the game becomes a lot more linear once we reach Anor Londo, after which we have to defeat 4 main Lord Souls, which are scattered around the map. Some of them require you to backtrack towards previous side areas that beforehand didn't really have as much to offer as the main path. And then once we've defeated all 4 of these in any order we like, we can finally fight the final boss and then be done with it. Dark Souls 2 has a branching hub area in Majula, yet the game is more linear, as each of these branches only connect to themselves. Additionally, the 5 presented paths are split, with 3 requiring items or progression to enter, and 2 being immediately available. But before we get to the inaccessible areas, one interesting change is that the 2 available areas have a similar level of difficulty. This makes the trivialization I talked about earlier somewhat inherent, as going down one path will make the other easier. Yet I still like this as a decision, as a player who may be struggling with the Forest of the Fallen Giants or the Lost Bastille that directly follows it, can go down Hydas Tower instead to acquire more items and souls. This also adds some depth for second playthroughs, as players who have played before can choose which path to go down, based on whether they want access to miracles or to melee upgrades. My biggest criticism of this design is that the merchant selling life gems is exclusive to the Forest of the Fallen Giants, despite the item being universally valuable. The decision to go with a branching structure, as opposed to the interconnected web that makes up Dark Souls, means that Dark Souls 2 exercises more direct control over its later areas. The clearest example of this is in the Shaded Woods, one of the aforementioned blocked paths in Majula. The petrified character blocking the way to the Shaded Woods requires an item found in multiple locations, the Fragrant Branch of Yore. This item is sold by Melentia, the merchant on the forest path, yet it costs a hefty 12,000 souls, well out of reach for most players unless they give up the souls acquired for defeating a boss. Alternatively, players can defeat a boss to access the second area of either starting path, both of which contain a Fragrant Branch. A better example of this comes in the form of a pit in the centre of Majula that's oh so inviting. To descend it, the player must either find a ladder by progressing through the game and meeting a particular NPC that sells ladders, or be able to survive the initial fall into the pit. This comes in the form of a major vigour check, that can be greatly mitigated by purchasing a ring from the nearby cat merchant that reduces fall damage, or one of the several other items and mechanics that reduce fall damage. This is progression that's really fun to solve organically, and the early solution being tied to one's health means that the player is at least somewhat prepared for the pure evil that is the Gutter and Black Gulch. The final piece of the puzzle for Dark Souls 2's level progression is fast travel to any unlocked bonfire being available from the start of the game, as opposed to Dark Souls 1, where it was tied to the Lord Vessel item, which is only found very late into the game. This allows for this branching structure to work, as players can return to the start at any time, and follow up on any of the other branches as and when they choose. This is still far less impressive than Dark Souls area design, as warping back to go down a different branch is obviously less cool than those two branches intersecting, with the Lost Bastille being connected from both starting paths being the only example of this interconnection I can think of. And all the primordial bonfires that teleport you back to Majula at the end of each of the paths, especially the one following Sinner's Rise, just look so bad, and it really does take away from the whole experience. The levels themselves are a little less densely packed than Dark Souls, generally being more expansive, but still brimming with secrets. One change I enjoyed was using the interact button to find hidden walls. This was taught to me by an area in Huntsman's Copse, and it recontextualized all previous areas. It was a light bulb moment I hadn't had with a hidden wall in quite some time, and it's a cool thing a sequel can do that specifically enriches repeat playthroughs and exploration. For the most part, I enjoyed the larger areas and solving how to fight when outnumbered, though a level that sticks out to me as wasted potential is Earthen Peak, whose windmill level is fun to fight through, but the central acid draining puzzle is incredibly poorly telegraphed and has a pretty boring solution. The mechanisms themselves being largely irrelevant feels like a gigantic missed opportunity, and prevents the level from feeling truly unique from a gameplay standpoint. Having to decipher a set of cogs and axles to open the right shortcuts would have been a far more interesting decision than the hidden bonfire and the torch puzzle. Maybe if the torch was generally useful for puzzles in the world, burning the windmill would at least be more intuitive, though still boring. Otherwise, the levels do a great job at keeping pace with the boss fights in terms of difficulty, while still having plenty to explore. Though some of the bosses feel slightly underpowered or too simple in order to justify some of the runbacks. Dragon Rider is forgivable due to how early the boss is, but Demon of Song is such an anticlimax to an otherwise engaging and challenging level. Next up, we have Dark Souls 2, which, as you can probably tell from comparing these two, it's a fair bit more simple. The game starts in the hub world of Majula and branches out with 5 different paths. All 5 paths must be completed to access the final levels and play against the final boss. Now, in order to explore each of these areas, we have to go down some of the paths, and within each of the paths there are certain areas, certain items that can be collected that allow you to unlock the later paths and just generally acquire more stuff, more items, more loot, meet new characters, the usual that's in Dark Souls. However, this exploration is, I would say, a fair bit less organic than in the original game. In the original game, the options are presented to you constantly during your path. However, in Dark Souls 2, in order to go down another path, you will typically end up completing one of the paths, reaching the end, realise there's nothing left to do, it's a literal turn back point, and then you'll go back and say, what do I have next to do? Rather than a matter of being inquisitive or adventurous, it's a matter of obligation to unlock the next area. Finally, we come to Lies of P, a game whose progression does not take much explaining. The game takes place over 11 chapters, completed in order, with the single side area only unlocking really late into the game, that only has a small amount of loot and it doesn't have a boss. The game is almost completely linear, and as such can carefully control how powerful the player is at any point through its placement of items. The experience is generally tailored such that every boss is a challenge, though still not a strict difficulty curve. The Scrapped Watchman feels far more of a challenge than Fuoko, despite Fuoko appearing after the Watchman. The player gets a steady supply of new weapons and tools throughout, and these systems never feel overwhelming due to how they're paced. This results in a dynamic and varied combat system that has really impressive depth despite not having as many weapons as the Dark Souls games have weapons and magic. Another benefit of this linearity is having a character-driven narrative. Lies of P is an active narrative that extends beyond a vague desire to take the throne or bring about a new age, with interesting NPCs and cutscenes that actually incentivize caring about the story, its characters, and the world. Geppetto's puppet, the player character, has an arc that goes beyond simply becoming more powerful, whereas the main character in the Souls games often feels like a vessel to explore the world rather than a character in themselves. The narrative of the Dark Souls series is rather thin in terms of what the player character accomplishes. All the more interesting elements about the world are confined to history, found in item descriptions and through NPCs. Lies of P is an active, player-driven narrative and enough history to sink your teeth into as well. With all this being said, the downsides to this linearity are far-reaching and closely entwined with the individual level design, but purely on a macro scale, the game is robbed of almost all sense of player agency in exploration. There simply are no other places to go, which makes some narrative sense, but if you're stuck on a boss, you just have to get good. The aforementioned mechanical depth does help out here, with the grindstone buffs, legion arms, and summons each being capable of helping out a struggling player, and the weapon upgrades available are enough to do significant damage to every boss. Even ignoring the difficulty complications that come with a totally linear Souls-like, moments of discovering a new location lack the same sense of adventure that I got from finding the painted world of Ariamis in Dark Souls 1, or venturing down the gutter in the sequel. Player agency is key to exploration feeling satisfying and immersive. Feeling unsubtly on rails for the whole of Lies of P is a great way of removing any sense of adventure whatsoever. The most interesting the game gets are in its cryptic vessels, small riddles and picture clues that lead you to treasure without the annoying objective markers that plague most quests in the game. These are great, but sadly limited, and don't make your first time exploring an area any more interesting. They're reserved for backtracking through the levels, though this too can be a bit tedious when you've easily picked them clean on your first time around. This problem gets far worse when considering the levels themselves. The first 3 chapters of the game have a strict corridor structure, with shortcuts built into the main path, and the occasional mini-boss available either on or right next to the main path, based on whether or not it was optional. Secrets are almost entirely absent. No illusory walls is a fine design decision on its own, but missing items often requires more effort than finding them in the first place. The placement of side passages is rare, and they never go far, usually connecting back to the level with a somewhat useless shortcut. Speaking of shortcuts, Lies of P might impress with its interconnected level design at first, but when all of the shortcuts are immediately visible, and the player never has to go out of their way for them, then they become functionally identical to more checkpoints. Their consistency in when they appear, and the Ouroboros structure that leads to them, constantly breaks the immersion of a level, undermining the game's incredible visuals and sound design by reminding you that you're in a corridor, a fancy corridor. In Dark Souls, shortcuts aren't a given every so often in the level, and they're interspersed with other secrets, surprise enemy encounters, and complex architecture, meaning that you have to go out of your way to find them, and expose yourself to risk by exploring more directions with your limited healing, and making it a player decision to look for a bonfire or a shortcut in the face of danger. Enemy placement is another key factor in the level design of a Souls-like, with gank fights, mini-bosses, sneak attacks and traps all being tools to test the player's mettle. Lies of P does do mini-bosses excellently, with some tricky, irregular attacks that main bosses often avoid being used well to create challenging encounters without needing the complexity of a main boss. Indeed, many of the mini-bosses in Lies of P are so good that they could easily be main bosses in a lesser game. The other types of challenges levels usually have are less challenging than they should be, with most enemy encounters being one at a time, woefully outmatched by the player, and falling victim to the oldest trick in the book, backstab circle strafing. You are far too agile and powerful to have the same enemy encounters as the chosen undead of Dark Souls. The worst part is that Dark Souls 2 has significantly more challenging and engaging non-boss areas, despite the player character being far slower to attack and defend. The difficulty of the non-boss encounters in Lies of P exists in direct contrast to the difficulty of its bosses, which never stop challenging the player in unique and brilliant ways. The big exceptions to this for me are the Grand Exhibition and Arch Abbey. The former is an interconnected shortcutting level, but some of the shortcuts are well concealed and fit neatly into the shape of the level, instead of being a ham-fisted rectangular design pasted several times over. The verticality makes a big difference in the enemy fights too, with the beams at the top being particularly perilous, while the open exhibit floor is home to large, speedy robots that dominate the flat spaces. Arch Abbey, on the other hand, is simply excellent, being one of the few levels to properly hide items, varying encounters from the tricky ganks to mini-bosses and traps, all while varying the shape of the level, using the low light of the indoor section to conceal traps and enemies, and using the verticality of the scaffolding outside, not only as an environmental hazard, but also for letting enemies lurk up above until they can potentially land a jumping attack. The entrance is one of the best designed runbacks to a boss in my opinion, using a non-respawning set of difficult enemies to encourage the player to engage with the level before the boss, so as to conserve their healing, but cutting down this runback immensely once the player has overcome this challenge. Additionally, the boss used is not overly complex, but still challenging enough to encourage the player to actually engage with the level beforehand, instead of running past the enemies each time. For our final recap, we have Lies of P, which follows a strict chapter system for its progression, going level boss, until the very end. While this is a great controlled environment for the difficulty of the game, it does mean that the exploration is a bit less organic, a bit more contrived than something that's more freeform, like Dark Souls. The clearest examples of this are actually involving Hotel Krat, our hub world for the game. We start here and carry on going through each of the levels, and about halfway through the game we reach a level at the end of which connects back to Hotel Krat. This shortcut is never really anything more than just neat, due to a complete lack of player agency. You never chose to go down this path or go down this shortcut. It's simply the only possible avenue to progress. It's less of an interesting adventure and more just you following the same singular trajectory that Lies of P has had you on from the start and will continue to have you on until the very end. So what conclusions can we draw from this analysis? Well, the most obvious trend is one towards linearity, tight difficulty control, and a set boss order. This has its upsides, of course, especially in forcing the player to utilise more tools they have available, or mastering the boss itself. However, as the path to complete the game becomes more straightforward, it also becomes less immersive, more contrived, and lacks some of the exploratory magic that's present throughout Dark Souls. Specific levels also becoming more linear is a total negative. The levels quickly become repetitive and fail to reward the player for engaging with the level due to a lack of depth. A straightforward main path with little to no side paths makes these areas tedious walkways to the next boss, rather than an exciting new area to explore. In trending towards simplicity in their level design, Souls-likes run the risk of losing what the original had to set itself apart from contemporaneous linear adventure games.